this is Jack Stanley, and this is number 7 in my talk on the American presidency. I left us with Zachary Taylor and the Compromise of 1850 put together by John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster. And what it was basically a Band-Aid to basically keep the country together. The United States was fracturing apart basically because of states' rights. There was also an issue over slavery. Now, I got to tell you something about slavery. I think it's been overdone in our history today that we think that the American Civil War was purely about slavery. That is not the case. It was about money. It was about states' rights. It was about slavery as well. But to make slavery the main issue is incorrect. Now, you had the slaves, mainly in the South, but that does not mean we didn't have slaves in the North. I always tell people when they say, well, the Civil War was to fight against slavery. And I said, well, if that was the case, they would have invaded New Jersey. New Jersey had slaves till 1865. We don't think about that. But nonetheless, let's get back to Zachary Taylor and we will work our way to the Civil War, which gets really incredible. But the thing is that Zachary Taylor refuses to sign the Compromise of 1850. He said, they want to have a war? They're going to have to deal with me. Now, here's a man who was a slave owner, but he was not going to tolerate the bullshit from the South, as far as he saw it. And he was ready to take the army and go down south and deal with them. Things got very ugly. And the talk of civil war became more and more prevalent. And Zachary Taylor was not moving. And so everyone kind of looked to everything and saying, good God, it looks like we might actually have a war here. And then it was an interesting thing that happened. There was a July 4th celebration at the stump of the Washington Monument. That's all there was at that point. You know, it's an interesting thing. The cornerstone of the Washington Monument had just been laid by Dolly Madison and Mrs. Alexander Hamilton, two old dames from the time of the American Revolution. And they laid that cornerstone, I believe, in 1848. So in 1850, they had a celebration at the stump, which wasn't too high. It was a very hot, hot day. After the event, somewhat parched and overheated, Zachary Taylor rushed back to the White House and drank a pitcher of cold milk and a bowl of cherries. He got violently ill, most probably suffering from gastroenteritis. It was severe. Within a few days, he was dead. Now, what do we do? The Compromise of 1850 had been rejected by the president. War was expected to take place. And then suddenly, Zachary Taylor died. Millard Fillmore, who was his vice president, said, I'll sign it. I'll sign it right now. He didn't want a war. And so those three old-timers got together When they had their last get-together, John Calhoun would die shortly afterwards. And within the next 2 years, the other two would be gone. By 1852, all three of the creators of the Compromise of 1850 were dead. It's an interesting thing that Millard Fillmore's administration was hardly noticeable, hardly notable, and often he's listed as one of the most forgotten presidents. But there's an interesting thing about the White House during the occupancy of Millard Fillmore, who was a very smart, well-read, gregarious individual. Everybody was dying. When he assumed the presidency, of course, Zachary Taylor had just died, and the White House was covered with black crepe. And then over the succeeding number of months, a lot of people in government died. And so the White House was constantly in mourning. The vast majority of Millard Fillmore's administration was dealing with official funeral activities. Now, there are some interesting things about Millard Fillmore. As I said, he was a well-read man, very smart, very gregarious, very handsome, considered one of the more handsome presidents. But also, he sent a naval squadron to Japan to open up diplomatic relations. That would be Admiral Perry. Of course, this would not happen until the next administration, but Millard Fillmore was the one that started that. I have to tell you, it's really an amazing thing with the Compromise of 1850 that war almost started, that there was almost a collapse of the government, that the president was ready to administer, if need be, a military for a civil war. And then it was basically solved by the president dying. Now this left an ugly taste in the mouth of some people who said, compromise, civil war, stubborn president in the way. Maybe somebody killed him. That was a thought and a conspiracy that was passed around for well over 130 years. It was interesting to note that it got to such a fevered pitch that in the, I believe, early 1990s, Zachary Taylor, through the permission of his family, was exhumed, and his body was examined, what was left of it. And they found he had no more arsenic, because they were suggesting that he was poisoned with arsenic. He had no more arsenic than what would be expected. And so that laid that to rest. It was just an amazing coincidence. And so Millard Fillmore was president. As I said, hardly much of a presidency. And then who came in? There's two presidents that come in now who are basically rather weak and rather useless. The first is Franklin Pierce, who his enemies, who knew he had a drinking problem, said he was the victor of many a hard-fought battle. He was perhaps the most handsome president we ever had. I'm sure everyone's sitting there going, what did he look like? Most people don't even know he existed. but he was perhaps one of our most handsome presidents. And a heavy, heavy drinker. He was not against slavery. He was a Northerner. He didn't have slaves, but he wasn't going to fight against it. The ugliness of so many things happened during his administration. You had Bleeding Kansas. You had Douglas's whole big thing about popular sovereignty. You had so many issues taking place in which the country was really starting to fall apart. And then you had the Dred Scott decision. All of this led to the total destruction of the presidency of Franklin Pierce. He wasn't even asked to run again. And he made the comment that there's probably nothing else to do but go home and get drunk. Pretty sad. And he would spend the rest of his days home. His wife was terribly depressed. Their son was killed on the train ride to Washington, right before their eyes. How dreadful. His wife, who was very depressed to begin with, just made Mary Lincoln look like a giggling fool. Give you an idea how depressed Franklin Pierce's wife was. And Pierce himself suffered from depression. After the presidency, he spent time with friends. His wife died. Then, of course, he was friends with the writer Hawthorne, who he was with when Hawthorne died. And then Pierce just went home and drank himself to death. Pretty sad. The next individual to assume the presidency is an individual who became president because he knew nothing. Now, that sounds bizarre, but it's very, very true. James Buchanan was our ambassador to the court of St. James in England. And you have to understand, in 1856, when the presidential election is coming forth, there's a whole new political party called the Republicans. And they have a candidate, Fremont, John Fremont, the Pathfinder from California, running for office. He has his views. There's a lot of people, Lewis Cass and others, and they all have their views. And Stephen Douglas has his views. Almost everybody has views pertaining, to Kansas, pertaining to Dred Scott, pertaining to slavery, pertaining to all of this. James Buchanan had been out of the country for a few years, so he didn't state anything because he really wasn't aware of everything. And even if he wasn't talking about it. And so he ran for president on the grounds that he was out of the country and really didn't know too much, as insane as that sounds. He's elected. Now, he is our first gay president. It's kind of an interesting thing. As I said, James Buchanan had a partner, is Senator King of Alabama. They were together for many, many, many years. And Buchanan was a strange guy in many respects. His skin was very, very white, and he always kind of dressed up like somebody's old aunt. It's the only way to describe him. He was kind of an interesting character. He was far-sighted in one eye and nearsighted in the other, which made him kind of look at people like this. He would turn his head, and it was kind of an interesting stance. He also had great social events at the White House. Politically, it was a disaster. There's an old saying that James Buchanan's administration was socially successful and politically disastrous, because not only did James Buchanan let the country start to fall apart, but he also meddled with the Supreme Court on telling some justices how to vote on the Dred Scott decision, which was totally and completely illegal and, as far as I'm concerned, impeachable. Nonetheless, James Buchanan took office, and lots of things would happen, and we will get into that in our next installment.